Scott Walton. I hope everybody's having a great day. Wanted to, I'll provide my answers to your poll questions there. Specifically on the government side, we've actually seen probably about 5 years worth of digital modernization and movement to the cloud just in the last 6 months. So this has definitely been a big accelerator in terms of with everybody working from home, things along those lines. It has definitely accelerated the government's appetite for moving to the cloud. The other thing, to your second question, yes, it absolutely depends upon how you configure and what policies you set up for your cloud implementation. So with that said, I will launch into my presentation. And forgive me, I'm having a little bit of screen lag. Do you see the traditional model slide?
Yes, we do.
Okay, got it. So the first thing I wanted to kind of open with was kind of a step back and say, a lot of what we've seen is when we first started working in our jobs, we noticed that we oftentimes went into a particular place, and our work was defined by the place where we went, and it was oftentimes defined by a device that was given to us by our employer. And that was then connected to a network which was provided by that employer. And depending upon what type of place where you were working, you might have had to go through security checkpoints, whether that's presenting a badge, presenting some other sort of credential, and you might even use one of those credentials as part of your login. But what we've seen over time is that that no longer cleanly identifies what work is, especially over the last 6 months. We've really seen that the perimeter of the workplace has changed in a very dramatic fashion. We now see, especially when you look at from the perspective of like COVID, we've definitely seen that work can be something we do over a VPN. It could be something we do over some other sort of brokered connection to our workplace. And we've also seen the adoption of, and some of this is not necessarily directly related to COVID, but we've also seen the adoption of a number of cloud services. So those cloud services have really kind of changed where you keep your crown jewels. In most cases, if you look at the past, there were cases where you kept all of your most sensitive data locked in your corporate network, locked in your data center. And now with the introduction of, whether it's SaaS applications or whether you're using Azure or you're using AWS or Google Cloud, all of whom will, be presenting here today, you will find that that creates a different landscape to which the network defenders have to be able to react to those things. Now, on top of that, we also have another challenge. And while we said traditionally you have a device which is provided to you by your employer, we're now seeing that devices are proliferating. My children have iPhones. We have a variety of different devices that we use to access our corporate information, our Amazon accounts, our Microsoft accounts. We even talk about like using gaming consoles as a way to do work. So how do you secure all this bring your own device landscape? So one of the things that we want to kind of double click on, as we like to say, is that the world is changing very rapidly. 94% of organizations that we're tracking are using the cloud. And the use of the cloud can be, the newer organizations are using the cloud writ large. I mean, they are really going out there, and in some cases they say, why do I need to have an on-premises infrastructure? I don't need to have it at all, so I'm just going to put everything in the cloud. Other organizations, more traditional organizations, or those with regulatory requirements, they are going to look at that a little differently and say, over time, we will migrate capabilities to the cloud. We are now reaching a point where we have more connected devices, more devices connected to the internet than we have people in the world. And think about that for a second. Now, granted, that's not evenly distributed across the world, but that's a whole lot of devices. And that's driven things like we talk about IPv6 and new ways of addressing devices across the internet. So that's a big change, and that's a big source of data that we'll talk about a little bit more. The next thing is that we see a whole bunch of business apps being used on people's phones. I think about some of the apps that I use, especially in more normal times when I'm traveling. Those are apps where we're using partner applications to really go out there and to make things happen more quickly. The thing that used to take you 30 minutes on the phone with a customer service rep, you now take care of on a business app in 30 seconds or less. And then coupled with that, we now see that a lot of organizations, a growing number of organizations, have formal bring your own device programs in place. So what that's doing is over time, we're getting where the bring your own device, the non-corporately owned device and non-corporately managed device now accounts for a greater portion of what is connecting to those networks. So kind of to take all that, we've gone from what was the old world, all those things listed on the left. We used to say that users were employees. Well, that's not necessarily true anymore. Employees are now, the people who are using your network are your employees, your partners, your customers. Increasingly, we see things like artificial intelligence with bots interacting with data and interacting with users on your network. We've gone from a world where almost every device was a corporately managed or corporately owned device to now where we have a lot of bring your own device coming into the infrastructure. And organizations have to be able to accommodate that. And I'll tell you, I know many of you are not government affiliated. We're even seeing this in the Department of Defense. We're even seeing this where we want to be able to take into account the fact that every young Marine has a cell phone, and many of them haven't used computers per se, but they know how to use that cell phone really well. And also all the IoT devices that come along with those things, all those sensors. We've gone from a world where a lot of the applications that we used on a daily basis were on premises. You knew that they were somewhere in your data center, to now where we have this explosion of cloud applications. And coupled with that, we used to have a lot of the ERP suites and other sort of business application suites, but now we're seeing examples of very, very well orchestrated composite applications and the ability to call APIs from across the internet to make things happen. I will admit to you, sometimes I am very impressed with some of the things that people are able to orchestrate via various applications. Clearly, and I think all of us, this probably doesn't need much explanation, we now see that our corporate network is no longer really defined by that firewall perimeter. We now see that we have to find different ways to expand the perimeter, but at the same time keep it secure where only the right people can come in and can interact with you and your information, etc. And probably where it's most relevant to this conversation, we see that the old ways of performing cybersecurity, where we used to do local packet tracking on our network and logging, those are really no longer sufficient to make educated and well-informed decisions about cybersecurity. So what we've determined is, this is Microsoft along with many others in the space, is that we need to adopt zero trust principles. And these three principles you will find in almost anyone who's talking to you about zero trust will present something to you very similar to this. The first is the need to verify explicitly, that real need to make sure that you know who you're dealing with and you know where they're coming from, that you know as much about that user as possible. So you can make the most fully informed decision about who they are and to what you should allow them to access. The second part of this is to use least privilege access. So I'm a military guy. I've been in the Marine Corps for a long time, and I kind of refer to this as, don't walk around with a loaded weapon. There have been cases where we've walked into organizations and determined that there are a lot of users who, when they log in with administrator credentials. And I will tell you that's a very dangerous practice and one that you should attempt to avoid. And if you're currently doing it, figure out a way to deprecate the practice. The idea is that you want users to log in and have user permissions. And then over time, what you'll be able to do when they need it, perform just in time with just enough access to perform the administrative functions that are required for those actions. So you're only, quote unquote, loading the gun when it's needed, because we all recognize that those administrative privileges, they are very powerful for you as an individual, but things can go wrong if they're used incorrectly. And finally, Something that we've all seen, you know, and there's the old saying, you know, there's two types of people: those who've been breached and those who have been breached and those who admit to it. So essentially, you should always assume that you have been breached and put in place a network architecture that can place you and posture you as well as possible to react to a breach when one is determined. And that involves doing things like setting up network security rules and making sure that the way your network is architected enables you to very quickly drop the defenses that are necessary to put in place to prevent the exfiltration of your data, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to protect is the data. So all of this is that what I just described to you is the kind of the core underpinnings and the philosophy behind the Microsoft Zero Trust approach. Our Zero Trust approach is an integrated approach, and what we're going to do is we're securing your access with adaptive controls. You'll see that it's not a binary yes/no decision. It's going to be a series. I refer to it as a dimmer switch, where what we allow you to do is via tools like Conditional Access, we are able to modulate how much access a user has depending upon where they're coming from, how much we trust them, and what sort of device they're using and how they are accessing the data. We're able to do that, and we can leverage that capability across the entire digital estate. So when we talk about the digital estate, this is one where you want to make sure that you know who you're talking to and how they define the problem. We define it across 6 principal pillars. And those 6 principal pillars are defined here as identities, devices, applications, infrastructure, networking, and data. I will call your attention to the 2 on the left, identity and devices, because those are what we consider to be foundational elements of security. And then on the right over there, when you talk about data, that's ultimately the thing that you're trying to protect the most. I mean, you care about the other things, but you really want to make sure that your data, which is your principal competitive advantage, is not compromised. And so what we're looking at here is the architecture then, and notice that those identity and devices, which I said focus on those on the left, those are going to be your foundational elements. Those are the things that if I had to say, you know, prioritize your initial investments, it's going to be there on the left with your identity and device strategy. And then on the right, you're going to, want to make sure that you have a handle on, that you know what data you have, that you've classified it, you've encrypted it, that you know what applications you're using, that you know and understand the infrastructure. Many customers that I speak to, when I ask them to describe their infrastructure, it very quickly turns into a fluffy cloud diagram, and that fluffy cloud diagram isn't there to describe using the cloud. It's there to describe the fact that they don't have a lot of familiarity and clarity around what's happening behind the scenes. But all of these things, all of those pillars, they're basically the arms and legs of Zero Trust. What we need is a central nervous system. We need that central nervous system that can orchestrate these various arms and legs together so it can walk and it can move in a coordinated fashion and can accomplish things. And so those elements that are there in the center of this slide, I'll call your attention to, because every organization has a different policy. The policy that Exxon uses is different than the policy that JP Morgan Chase uses, is different than the policy the National Security Agency uses. And those are all for good reasons, but your policy needs to be set and it needs to conform to the requirements of your organization. And what we need is a mechanism where it can enforce those policies as needed. However, where we oftentimes find that people are making incomplete decisions is because they have a lack of knowledge of what's going on external to or adjacent to their organization. So something that we emphasize in our approach is the introduction of threat intelligence. So with our threat intelligence, we're able to see the threats that are being encountered by users of our cloud services. And so what that then goes into is, how do we do those bottom tasks, that visibility and analytics, as well as the automation, to make sure that we're orchestrating and responding to threats in real time to keep our customers most secure. So now I'm gonna kind of dive down into each one of these pillars, and the objective of this is kind of just to help you to understand what the principal objects are in each one of the pillars, and to kind of identify what the short list of to-dos should be for anyone who's approaching a zero trust implementation. So one of the principal, what we call a control plane at Microsoft, is identities. We've seen that that identities are now perhaps more important than physical network demarcation. The idea here is, and many of you can think about this yourself, when was the last time you logged into a service using your Amazon ID or your Microsoft ID or your Facebook ID? Facebook has become quite prolific in terms of people using their Facebook IDs for other services outside of the first-party Facebook application. And that is something where that enables single sign-on and other capabilities, but you just want to make sure that you understand how those things are being used. We view single sign-on as a way to not only make life easier for your user community, but also as a way to improve your overall security posture. Then looking over here at verifying identities with multi-factor authentication, many of you are probably using multi-factor authentication, whether on a personal level or on a corporate level, and both are very good practices. But that ability to use multi-factor authentication to further secure your identity, you will really see that that has a tremendous impact on your ability to secure your infrastructure. The next thing, and this is kind of a bleed over from that smart policy enforcement, is that ability to apply conditional access, that dimmer switch that I was talking about before. Those are those abilities to apply policies that are appropriate to your organization to make sure that you're allowing people to have access at the right time and at the right level. And then finally, we talked about, don't walk around with a loaded gun, enforce least privilege access with strong governance, make sure that you're only giving the users what they need to have when they need to have it. So we'll double click a little bit on those. This is talking about single sign-on. So a lot of people, they may have legacy, whether you talk about it, whether it's an Oracle, PeopleSoft, SuccessFactors, whatever, Workday, whatever HR system. They talk about, how do I get from here to there? How do I create an environment where I have single sign-on? And what we tell them is that oftentimes those organizations that have those HR systems, they oftentimes have legacy Active Directory, Windows on-premises Active Directory. What we're able to do, and this is a critical first step, is to take those HR records and those Active Directory records and consolidate them in an Azure Active Directory. That's a cloud-hosted identity repository. And then what we're able to do with that is we're able to then categorize those users and to determine who your administrators are, determine what sort of permissions those users should have from the get-go, and then enable access not only to your cloud applications, because most people expect, hey, if this is my cloud identity repository, it should be able to enable single sign-on to cloud applications, and you're absolutely correct, it should and does, but we should also be able to enable application proxying so that as you're making this move over time from on-premises to the cloud, you're still able to access your on-premises capabilities and other hosted capabilities so that you can continue to move through those. And what this does is it gives you that backwards compatibility. And what it does is, as opposed to having this proliferation of usernames and passwords, it enables your users to have one identity and to use it across the enterprise. The next thing, and we talked about this a little bit, the thing that I really want to draw your attention to is that panel on the right. Multi-factor authentication prevents 99.9% of identity attacks. That's a foot stomper, because we oftentimes hear about how, credentials are harvested. We hear about, not so much anymore, but, we've heard about keyloggers over time. A lot of different ways that attackers have been able to compromise our identities historically. You can really spoil their attack by using multi-factor authentication. The classic, something you know, something you have. whether that's using an authenticator application. We have one, Google has one, Facebook, I believe, has one as well. Whether you're using a hard token, whether you're using, SMS, although SMS has a little bit of a problem with spoofing, so you don't want to rely upon that for really high security applications. But the bottom line here is that more than creating really complex password policies, more than forcing your users to change their passwords every so often unless you have evidence of them being compromised, the most important thing for you to do is to use multi-factor authentication. And multi-factor authentication kind of helps you to keep your identities secure and to know that the person who's on the other end of that request to access resources is really who you think it is. Now, talking a little bit about smart policies. So the thing, and we consider this to be an identity because ultimately what you're granting access to is an identity. There are a number of signals, and traditionally what we've seen is that when you talk about that physical traditional perimeter, people talk about, well, I'm in the building, I knew my username and password, I was connected to the port, blah, 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 and I'm using a piece of your equipment. And the answer from the answer is, okay, yes, you can use my network. Well, that's really no longer sufficient when you start talking about a world where people are using whatever device they have from wherever they might be. And so what we begin to look at is what sort of signals can we collect to develop a fully informed picture of who this user is and what they're attempting to do. So if you look at that panel over here with all the signals, so the signals would be who is the user and where are they coming from? And we know that we can geolocate IP addresses pretty well. What kind of device are they coming to us from? And what's the state of that device? Is it an iPhone running a jailbroken iOS? Is it a user using a corporately provided laptop? That may place that person into different categories. What sort of application are they using to access the network? And what sort of data are they attempting to access? And then over here on the right, when I think back on my threat intelligence picture, have I seen any indicators of compromise related to either this user's device, this user's identity? Have I seen any sort of suspicious activity coming from that IP address block or that IP address itself? So looking at all those things, I put it into, I'm going to use a highly technical term here, the gonculator, and I will then attempt to make a determination about what level of access I'm going to provide that user. So you see you have a variety of different choices here. One could be allow full access. Another could be to challenge that user to use MFA, which you might want to set a timeout for how recently it's been since they've been MFA'd. The next option could be you could limit their access, maybe not allow them to access the way that they're trying to access, or to challenge them to go to a VPN, or to challenge them to come at it from a different way. Or finally, you can just block it. And what we've seen here is that if you block these things and you give the user the ability to work their way back onto the net, it does have a real powerful effect, and it helps your users to do the things that you want them to do to interface with your network and your data more securely. And then we talked a little bit about this, and I think this is probably one of those things where we've all probably experienced this, especially probably many of the people on here are IT people. We've oftentimes seen that I believe we call it admin rights aggregation, where over time a person can be onboarded into a role, and they get onboarded in and they access, and there's some oversight, and people are verifying that they still need those rights. But then over time we all change jobs, and then we get another role assigned to us, but very rarely do we have that other role removed. And so what we're looking at here is to make sure that we put in place a process where we identify what rights a person has, and we do these access reviews where periodically a role owner or the user themselves receives a request to review whether they still need the permissions that they've aggregated over time. And you can also audit these to see how often the user is using those permissions, and if they don't use them over time, you can end of life cycle them as well. So what this does is it helps you to basically kind of heal the user community over time, and to make sure that people are not acquiring privileges unnecessarily. So that concludes the identity overview. Like I say, identity is one of the ones that we spend a lot of time at Microsoft focused on, because we really do believe that whether it's a Microsoft and what we call an MSA account, or whether it's a Google ID, a Facebook ID, whatever ID it might be, the identity truly is the new perimeter, and it's increasingly how we're seeing users accessing systems. The next part I want to talk about is devices. So the objective here is we want to make sure that we're only allowing devices that are compliant and trusted to some degree. Now, you may trust a device at either an application level or at a device level. And so what we have to do here, and these are some of the key objectives here, is you want to make sure that you have the ability to peek into that device. And I don't mean that in a nefarious way, but many of you, if you have your bring your own device policy and they allow you to access resources, you will see that there's oftentimes a management module which is placed onto that device. And we have those capabilities. We partner with other organizations that do that as well. And we can do it either on a mobile device management level, where you're managing the device, or we do it where you're managing the application, mobile application management, and that's where you're managing an enclave on the device. We can also make sure that you have policies and procedures in place to restrict access from those vulnerable and compromised devices. One of the best examples is the jailbroken devices. We have also seen examples where there might be an operating system that's been compromised on some sort of level, and you don't want to allow it to access your resources and force remediation. You can do that. And then finally, kind of like we were talking about before with that mobile device management, mobile application management, you can put in place policies, which what they do is they force users to either upgrade their antivirus on the device, or it can force them to remove a program or to allow a program, something along those lines. So we talked a little bit about mobile application versus mobile device management. This is oftentimes one of those things where people begin to ask questions, and I don't blame them, because if it's my personal device, I'd want to know what those capabilities are doing as well. What we offer is capabilities that look at the things that are listed right here on the slide. Looking for malicious apps, identifying when a device or the operating system has been manipulated or compromised. Look at network exploits. Could be looking at the IP stack on that device and looking for, has there been any sort of traffic shaping to look at how the traffic is being moved. Data privacy violations is something on that device slurping data off of the device in a way that you, as the organization that's providing trusted data, would not want data moved. And then finally, you can force encryption, you can force operating system upgrades, you can also move email profiles. Now, the mobile threat defense partners that you see listed down here, we have a number of partners, and the capability sets vary between each one of these. But the idea here is that when we talk about signal and when we talk about enforcement, we are capable of receiving telemetry from devices running these services down at the bottom, as well as delivering enforcement. But it's going to vary for each one of these partners. The next thing is, we talked a little bit about restricting access from vulnerable or compromised devices. What we are trying to do here is that make sure that from a health and status perspective, that we trust the health of that device enough to allow it to have access to the data. As you can see down there at the bottom, what we're depicting in the lower right is if it doesn't pass that endpoint health check, we can block access, we can force them to go to a remediation site where we then begin to work through step-by-step remediating how to work that device back on the network, or we can force the device to be wiped. Of course, that's going to depend upon what your policies are. assuming that that either they go through those remediation steps or they have a healthy device, as you see up there at the top route. We can allow them, we can enforce the MFA. We can also force them to enroll the device if they want to be able to use it to access corporately controlled data. So the idea here is just setting up kind of what are the rules in the road for how those devices can access data. And so this is the last slide for device management, where we talked a little bit about the differences between mobile device management and mobile application management. We're seeing more of a move. People are moving more towards mobile application management. And the idea there is that you not only have organizations where people are doing the bring your own device, which we've spoken about before, but also where people have multiple affiliations. And so you might have people who are an employee of an organization, but they're also a student, or they may be a military reservist, something along those lines. But what they're trying to do here is to depict that that with the mobile application management, you have a hybrid approach where you can publish those mobile apps and you can allow them to access your corporate data, but and you can place restrictions on how that is used, but you're not owning the device from the perspective of all of the management responsibilities, certificates, profiles, and then removing data as necessary. So all of this to say that, and this is oftentimes, especially when we deal with organizations that are moving from a very corporate, where they're used to issuing devices to their users, and they talk about going to a BYOD environment. Those are often some of the most illuminating conversations, because there's a lot of philosophical content around, well, what do you think? Do you think we should be managing the device or managing the application? You go through a big pro-con of each one of those. So it's something to definitely be considered as you embark upon something like this. Okay, applications. And as we mentioned before, the devices and identities are kind of where we tell most organizations to start their process. But applications are very big, and they've become more of a forefront item since COVID launched off, and it's primarily because of shadow IT. So we've had a lot of, we've identified a lot of different organizations that, well, the organizations haven't used shadow IT, but the organizations have definitely seen that their user community is using shadow IT. So the first thing we want to make sure of is that you and your organization understand which apps are in your environment and how they're being used, and discovering those things. The next thing is to make sure that you can extend your corporate governance enforcement into that session as well, and that you can make sure that your sensitive data in those applications is protected appropriately. And then also that you're able to protect your apps from risks and threats. And as we've said before, we've seen that a lot of organizations, they typically don't just use one cloud. And so how do you extend these protections to multiple clouds? So the first thing is we want to go out there, and we have cloud application services that can go out there and look at your IP address space and how your user community is using various capabilities, and identify and assess the risk level. And what you'll be able to do then at that point is to identify which ones are approved and unapproved. And if they're unapproved or unsanctioned, how do you go about blocking those and preventing their use? And so sometimes that's with a network security rule. Sometimes that's by forcing individuals to take it off their devices if you're managing the device at that level. A variety of different ways to go after that. The next thing is, and this goes back to conditional access, when we talk about making that initial conditional access determination, looking at who's the identity, where are they coming from, and et cetera, but also what application are they attempting to access my corporately controlled data via. So if they're using, I'll just say Microsoft Excel on an iOS device, I may decide that I'm going to allow that. If they're trying to access it using, some sort of open freeware or something along those lines that I don't necessarily trust, I can restrict it or disallow it. I could make it where they can only view the data. I could make it where there might be limitations placed upon what they're able to do. But a lot of this is going to require you to look at what sort of rules you want to have in place, because you might determine that someone going after your data using R to do data analysis might be entirely appropriate. But either way, look at that lower left-hand corner. You really want to flag that behavior and log it so that you can make sure that you analyze it. You may analyze it, investigate it, and determine it's entirely normal and something that you want to have going on, but it may be that you need to revisit what your policies are and change those. Okay. And then this is where the line between applications and data becomes somewhat, it's a very gray line. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you understand how your applications are managing and controlling your sensitive data, and that you have visibility into how the file sharing, the collaboration, how respect for classification labels is being handled. And a lot of this is you can get heuristics from the different applications that are being used. But similarly, you want to make sure that you have mechanisms to, as data is being generated or managed or analyzed as the output of analytics, you want to make sure that you're able to classify, label, and protect that data. So as that data is going back into the cloud for future use in your organization, that it's managed and labeled appropriately. And so we call that DLP, digital loss prevention, making sure that you're able to set those rules as data is being created. Perhaps one of the rules is if you create for official use only or confidential data, you want to encrypt it. You want to restrict where it can be placed. Maybe it has to be placed into an encrypted file share or only on certain sites that are inaccessible to certain types of users. You just have to kind of decide what those rules are for yourself. And then finally, an ability to remediate and monitor those data risks. So setting up what those policy definitions should be when you want to go after these things and identify when you're seeing behavior that is anomalous. Okay, now all of that is to say that we have a wide variety of partner applications that we once again have that ability to gather diagnostic data and log data from, that enable us to make sure that we understand what is going on. So, and you can see some of those, Google Suite. We can of course do that in our Microsoft products, Okta, Workday, Salesforce, etc. The idea here is that you're able to really see how applications are being used and how those applications are or are not creating risks from the cloud. Okay, infrastructure. We're moving into kind of the last couple of these. So infrastructure is, and this has become a very interesting topic. So when we talk about segmentation strategy, this is something that a lot of people, when they talk about zero trust networks, they talk a whole lot about micro segmentation, role-based access controls, being able to do very high confidence configurations, and also look for any sort of evidence of real-time attacks or anomalies. So what we like to say about microsegmentation is that one of the first important things is to make sure that your team is aligned on what sort of segmentation strategy you want to have. We oftentimes see that there is really robust and well publicized north-south network traversal strategies. However, where we don't see the same amount of rigor is on the east-west. So, for example, are the application servers able to talk to the database servers? Are the database servers able to talk to the front-end clients, or are there network segments that prevent that sort of traffic from taking place? So, what we have to make sure of is that there's an agreement on the part of the technical team to make sure that when we design those things, we have a repeatable pattern which is being used in all of our enterprise application delivery, because consistency is one of those key elements to making sure that you have a defensible infrastructure. The next thing is that what all of those things do, whether you talk about network security rules or you talk about virtual networks. It basically allows you to define inside of your infrastructure what is the perimeter, what elements of your infrastructure should be speaking to what other elements, so that you can once again assume breach, but then limit the blast radius of what's potentially going to come out from an exfiltration perspective. And then a final thing is that you should really be looking at your legacy capabilities. We oftentimes see that customers are moving they're moving their infrastructure, and they do a lift and shift up to the cloud, and that lift and shift kind of just perpetuates. They bring their trash along, as some people like to say. And what they really need to do is look at those legacy applications and determine, are there ways to micro-segment them so that they can begin to make them more secure. And then another thing that we see a lot of is, especially on that lift and shift, is that there are oftentimes configuration vulnerabilities. There are applications, containers, whatever it might be, that they're moved up there into the cloud, and they kind of hide in plain sight. They go out there, and there might be old versions of operating systems, unpatched versions of software, things that have known vulnerabilities that are not being adequately addressed. And so what we can do is we can continuously monitor and look across the cloud. And what Azure Security Center does is it's constantly going out there and looking for at your different cloud deployed resources and determining where you have deficiencies. And what it does, we kind of gamify this by using what's called Azure Secure Score. And Azure Secure Score kind of provides you a punch list of how you can improve your security posture, and we give you a numerical score. And so we identify what are the things that will get you the biggest points by improving those things. It might be upgrading the operating system of a VM. It might be something along those lines, or cutting off a port. But all those things, as you do them, they're going to raise your security score, and subsequently they're going to improve your security posture. And what that does, it also helps to drive your visibility into how compliant your environment is, but it also gives your security team and your application team more motivation to kind of fix those things. And then we also have a capability called Cloud Workload Protection. And what Cloud Workload Protection is, it's looking for different threats that we've identified that bad actors are moving against cloud services. So what this does is it allows us to inform via the Azure Security Center when we, using the threat intelligence capability, can see when attacks are taking place against various pieces of Azure infrastructure. And so those can take on a different form. Maybe it's a virtual machine, maybe it's a Cosmos DB database. It could be infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, even software as a service. But knowing where this is all taking place, so we can help to maneuver in the cloud to defend the services. And then network. So network and infrastructure, we oftentimes speak about these because there's a lot of common elements. And there you go, you see right there on the left-hand side, segment the networks and implement context-driven access controls. We also have the threat protection. And finally, we talk a whole lot about don't put your unencrypted data on the wire. So a lot of this, and we talked about this before during the infrastructure, is looking at ways to kind of make sure that we have put in place the right rule sets and the right pieces of virtual network infrastructure, so that we can make sure that you know who is accessing your services and that you can limit them to only authorized users. On the subscriptions bullet there on the left, what you will find is that we tend to logically organize our user identities at the subscription level. That's at the tenant. And that typically will help you to identify which identities are able to access resources within that subscription. That's not a hard and fast rule, but by default, that is how it's done. There are organizations that do higher end, more complex configurations, but as a general rule, that's how it's done. Virtual networks allow you to emplace those different resources within a virtual network space. And so what that does for you is you can say by default that virtual networks cannot communicate with one another unless you explicitly allow it. So that is also another way to make sure that we can kind of cauterize and traffic shape to make sure that different networks are not cross-pollinating. And then finally, we have Azure Firewall, which is used as you're attempting to manage traffic flow and make sure that only authorized services are moving around to one another. So you'll see a common theme here, which is the Microsoft Threat Intelligence. So what we're doing is we're looking for, is there DDoS? Are there bot attacks? Is someone using protocols? You know, how do we make sure that we are keeping the services that our customers put in the Microsoft Azure environment as available as possible at all times? And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that the right people are getting in, which is indicated there at the bottom as the legitimate user, but that we're preventing bad actors from spoiling services. We also do have a series of partner solutions which are available in Azure that can also be used to make sure that those various network resources are available. Okay, and then I think we all know from our days of seeing, you know, packet sniffers and things along those lines, that we always want to make sure that our data is encrypted, whether it's at rest, in transit, or in use, and we have a variety of capabilities that can do that. The last thing I want to cover real quickly is data. So this is, you know, when you talk about your crown jewels, in most people's cases, that's the data. You know, you want to make sure that you know what data you have that needs to be classified, that you apply the right level of protection with policies, and that you also can see how people are using your most sensitive data when they're risking it. So we want to make sure that we identify it. We have a number of different capabilities that can help you to identify sensitive data. And I will tell you that that bottom bullet down there about detecting common data types, PII, financial, whether it's social security numbers, bank account numbers, identify kind of those most common things. It's kind of entertaining to see people discover what they have on their network when they go out there and troll the first time. But once you have a good handle on what you have, then you're able to apply that protection policy, which this protection policy is then applied back through all of those other pillars of the zero trust architecture that we talked about before. And you can, as you can see, there's a number of different things you can do. You can force it to be encrypted. You can block them from sharing it. You can block the upload or download. We certainly, as a veteran, I can tell you if I had $1 for every time the VA lost my personal data, I probably would be giving this presentation right now. I'd be on a beach in the Caribbean. But, you know, so PII has definitely been disseminated over time. What we also want to make sure of is that we remediate data at risk. We want to make sure that when we do identify that data has been breached, that we're able to take the appropriate action and to either remediate risky sharing behavior, policy violations, you know, whatever that might be within your organization for how you manage those things. So, and then finally, all of this is, you know, we talk about visibility, analytics, and I would add to this orchestration, that ability to make sure that you have all of these things walking, talking, chewing bubblegum all at the same time, that you make sure that all of the various components in your clouds are able to talk together and to make well-informed decisions and orchestrated policy responses. And so what we use for that is called Azure Sentinel, and along with MTP, Microsoft Threat Protection, which is a lot of those different technologies to secure at the pillar level. So I know that I'm at time, but I hope you guys understand that this was very much kind of the 30,000 foot at 600 miles per hour overview of Microsoft Zero Trust. Please do not consider your education complete at this point. I would invite you to check out this website, aka.ms/zerotrust. This is where you'll find a lot of the data that Microsoft corporately has organized around our Zero Trust architectural approach. And there's definitely a lot of data, and we're putting it up there all the time. So with that, I will say thank you, and I will hand it back over